Well, welcome to Literary Lunch, and that you'll have an opportunity to read Jane Brox's book, Silence. It's marvelous. I read the book. There we go. The world-expanding nudge that comes from a new point of view. It reminded me of art classes. You probably had one where you walked in and the teacher said, you know, draw this, and then said, wait a second, there's a catch. You can only draw the negative space. And you thought, oh, well, we won't be able to see what's going on. But of course, understanding the negative space meant expanding and a deeper understanding of what you were looking at. And Jane has really given that to us in exploring silence. We pay a lot of attention to words, but if we didn't have the space between the words, they would quickly become meaningless. And so she's really looked at the space between and what happens in that space, both in monastic tradition, as it's chosen by the individual, but also the isolation of prison and solitary. So my novel has some scenes where silence is a conspicuous component of the setting, but I'm really here as a Quaker from Portland Friends meeting, where we gather in silence every Sunday morning. Spoken messages, if there are any, are given when someone feels led by the Spirit to share. Every week we have visitors to meeting. Some people find it torture to sit there for an hour and say nothing, and others comment that they feel like they've come home, that the silence welcomed them in a way that they had not met in other places. So how did you decide to explore both sides of this experience of silence?
I'm going to do this. I think I can face. I can face you better that way. Thank you, Beth. I first began. My first thought of writing this book came in 2001 when I visited a monastery in the south of France called Sanat, and I was really just astounded by the silence there and the architecture built for silence. But I didn't know how to handle the material. I couldn't imagine writing a book that would add anything to the long history of books about monastic silence. And but over the years, it stayed in the back of my mind. And then I happened to visit Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia about 6 or 7 years ago, and which was the first use of the silent and solitary confinement for criminal justice. And it was based on the monastic idea of the cell, and it was meant as a means of redemption. So, and walking through there and looking at the cells, which were so much like a monk's cell, all of a sudden I began to see how I could write a book that oscillates between these two architectures. I will say it also played into my limitations as a writer, because I knew I couldn't write a book that talked about silence in an abstract way. So that the architecture of silence, the architecture of these places helped me to ground my discussion of silence in the real world. So
about the working at monastic tradition of silence, pieces of that you be particularly intriguing for my...
Well, the great challenge was to find the shape of the discussion about silence, because there could be 1,000 books written about silence, and there are. And I was really, I found it very particular. These two places. I kept reading and reading, and my method of writing is to just try to take in everything and then whittle things down. And it's gallons of wash for the pure drop, as the poet Seamus Heaney said. So I found myself circling back to Thomas Merton, whom I had read in my 20s and had read sporadically ever since for 40 years. And I realized that his experience of silence was so complex, and it was a real argument with silence in many ways. And I found that I ended up honing in on that just because of the richness of it. And it helped me to situate it in the monastery, but ground it in the experience of one real person who grappled with it over decades. Yeah.
And the book really...
Right.
But he really woven that in with pieces from very old monastic writing about silence as well. So
Yeah.
you really get covered this, very much sort of the scope, because Merton, when was Merton?
Well, he wrote in the mid-20th century. He entered the monastery on the eve of World War II, and that informed his life. But, one of the things that really struck me in doing that research was, people have been searching for silence for century upon century, and that the search in the 3rd century was not, in many ways, different from the search in the 20th or the century. So I did want to give a sense of that. We always think that, we need more silence now. But even in the much quieter world of the Desert Fathers, the much quieter world of the 12th century monasteries in the early Middle Ages, they needed silence as much as we needed now. So it says something, I think, about silence to even ponder that search over the many centuries. Yeah.
I think one of my favorite stories from the Desert Father, which I think about sometimes when someone's visiting meeting, and I look and I think, I don't know what their experience is. And there was one of the came and visited the disciples and said, I want to talk to this guy. And so the disciples see this guy. He's really important. Talk to him today. I'll talk to him tomorrow. And this went on for several days. And finally, the very important person goes off in a huff. And the disciples go to him and say, to the Father, and say, what was that? Why didn't you see this very important person? You could have influenced the world and made the world a better place. And he says, well, if my silence didn't speak to him, my words would mean nothing. We also want to talk about the other element, which is woven through the book. And as I read, I was reminded of an experience I had last fall when my husband and I were on a trip in the Midwest. And on a whim, we decided we would go see the Hopewell Culture Natural Historic Park, which is, off in the middle of nowhere in southern Ohio. And we're turned down this little road, and suddenly we were confronted with the two biggest prisons I've ever seen in my life. And they're really deliberately invisible. I mean, I was just so struck that here were these huge prisons with thousands and thousands of people locked inside, but no, it wasn't like they were on a highway where people would drive by and talk about it. And that really is connected. What's going on right now with prisons is really connected to the origins. Can you...
Sure.
How did we get started on this?
Well, the idea for the penitentiary, for Eastern State Penitentiary, was the concept of Benjamin Rush, one of our founding fathers in the late 18th century. And at that time, the new United States was looking for a new means of criminal justice to replace the hangings and brandings of the past and to distinguish themselves from the European system of criminal justice. And they wanted something that was not only, they were looking for something more humane, but also something that wasn't quite so public. The jails at the time were located in the middle of cities, and they were very chaotic, and people could go up to the window and, you know, just talk to the people who were incarcerated. The hangings and brandings and whippings were very public. So Eastern State Penitentiary was eventually built on the outskirts of Philadelphia where there had been an old farm. So it was 3 miles outside of the city of Philadelphia. So it was the first instance of separating prisoners. And within the penitentiary, each prisoner was in their cell, was escorted to their cell in a hood so as to disorient them within the prison, so they would never know where they were. And each prisoner they were granted access to spiritual advisors, but they couldn't contact their family. They were not to speak unless instructed to. They were not to make any noise. And they were fed in their cells. They didn't with prisoners. So the direct line of that world of the penitentiary to solitary today, although it's very different in scale and different in intent. The prisoners in Eastern State Penitentiary were sentenced to immediate criminal system with punishment.
Because in your book, no one is sentenced.
Yeah. No one, yeah, because it's the idea of sentencing people to solitary confinement was done away with in the early 20th century. But it's interesting, I use the experience of prisoner number 1, Charles Williams, to almost be it's the opposite of Thomas Merton's experience. It's the imposed experience rather than the chosen. But the challenge was Thomas Merton left hundreds of thousands of words for me to wade through, and Charles Williams was mute. And the only records we have of his experiences are through observers who visited the prison or the prison records themselves. Yeah.
Which included Charles Dickens.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I've found a person who wrote extensively about her experience of silence in prison with Ginsberg.
Right. Eugenia Ginsberg, who was swept up in the Stalin's Great Purge. And I came across her because of, again, the writing presented its own challenges. And I was stumped as to where to go with Charles Williams' experience, but then it occurred to me, it's the same experience all over the world for almost 2 centuries, these people who have been committed to solitary. Eugenia Ginsberg's cell was remarkably similar to Charles Williams' cell over 100 years prior. But she wrote a memoir of her experience after getting 20 years after. She was in solitary for 10 years and then spent 10 years in Siberia, and then wrote this memoir of her time there. She was a very different personality and brought something very different to the cell, which was also interesting. I mean, it's not the same experience for everybody. It's a challenge to endure, but different people endure it differently. Yeah.
One of the topics which you actually did a whole chapter to, and is woven through some other parts of the book, looking at women in silence. And I was reminded of a friend of mine was telling me about her father, who was a very prominent person, and at home he was abusive to his wife and his kids. And one time when his wife was in the hospital, she actually said she hadn't fallen down the stairs. And so they recommended marriage counseling. The psychiatrist recommended that her mother take up knitting so that she would stop provoking her husband. So this is really
it struck me both in the penitentiary and the monastery that the experience of silence for women is emphatically different from the experience of silence for men, in part because there's a whole another layer of meaning for silence that women experience, and that goes way back to the punishments for gossiping, for or speaking too much in public for women. Gossips in 16th century England, for instance, could be bridled for speaking in public or for seeming to nag too much. This was the same in colonial America. In colonial America, they were dunked into a pond repeatedly. In England, they were often put a metal shield was put over their head and a bit was put into their mouth, and they were paraded through the streets. It was a severe and humiliating punishment in both instances. And that also, that shaming came in through even into the penitentiary, because there was no place for women in the original design of the penitentiary, in part because women who transgressed were thought not capable of redemption. And the penitentiary was supposed to be a means for redemption. So women were treated differently even in society for that transgression. And in the monastery, women, this wasn't always the case, but often the case, the convents were much poorer than the monasteries, and they were often women in the convents had much less freedom than monks had. So the order within the monastic tradition was also very different. But it's intriguing to me in the Middle Ages. I look at a group of nuns in southern France who we can't know what they thought, but it may have been that confinement, even in their poverty, even being crowded, they found more freedom than they could in society. And it's a really interesting question to bring up. I mean, I think in the book, I didn't want to answer questions. I wanted to present these situations and let the reader think about them, because some of these things are unanswerable. We can't know what they were thinking in that convent in the 13th century. Yeah.
I've recently been reading Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Both of these books, which are also nonfiction, include details on plants from her knowledge as a botanist. But that's almost background to her own stories as a mother and an Indigenous person. In silence, your own experience is almost a whisper by contrast. How did you decide how much of you to include in the book?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think it goes back to really my first books about my family farm were a personal narrative backed up by history. And then when I came to write Brilliant, one of the challenges of Brilliant, I gave myself as a writer. I said, I want to take the first person out of the narrative, but I want to create a voice that seems intimate. And so that was like kind of a challenge I gave myself as a writer. Then I thought, well, all right, I did that. I don't have to do that again. So, but I just felt as I worked on the material over the 6 or 7 years that I wanted, even though I had a very personal connection to the search for silence in a way, I wanted to keep myself in the background. So I'm more of a questioner and a wanderer who pops up at times than anything else. It wasn't about my personal story. It was about this phenomenon that was out in the world. So I thought it seemed right to keep myself in the background. So, yeah.
So, where? Yep. I want to give you and read from her book. So.
I'll just read a few paragraphs. This is the great challenge, to hold a microphone and read at the same time. But and this is actually, I do come in with a very personal story at the end of my first experience sort of dealing with a large silence when I was in my early 20s and living on my own on Nantucket Island, way out on the edge of the island one winter. And this is... But that winter was also my first serious attempt at the writing life, and I think those days allowed me to glean an understanding of what was possible in silence. I believe now that the time in Squam gave me the freedom to begin, and once I'd begun to work intently, it also gave me room to inquire into the life that I had hoped for and allowed me to make large decisions. I think I was more daring with my choices than I otherwise might have been. The silence may have been unsought to begin with, but it became a complex part of my life after a while. I grew to love the days when I could so intently focus on my work, grew to love the long walks in that austere landscape, and the continuity of thought that silence allowed. I also feared it at times. It could seem like a test, and I wondered the same things the world always wonders about silence. Was it an avoidance? An escape? And then I'll just skip to the end of that chapter. Silence can seem like a luxury, or the fraught world has labeled it that way. But from what I know of it, I would argue that silence is as necessary as the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech that we so carefully guard and endlessly ponder. For it affirms the meaning of speech even as it provides a path to inner life, to beauty and observation and appreciation. It presents the opportunity for a true reckoning with the self, with external obligation, and with power. As much as we need silence, it needs us. It needs more than a few hundred monasteries where a few thousand souls guard most of what's left of it. Like all else threatened by our onslaught, it must be attended to and valued, given space and time in which to gain strength again. And the stronger the silence, the more it will be able to withstand the noise and distractions of our world. So, anyway.
So we've got some time for questions, if we've got a few questions.
Well, the prisoners, some prisoners managed to. The prisoners who came out. It was difficult. It's difficult for all prisoners in forced silence and solitude against their will. Those who survive it best find a means of discipline. Whether Eugenia Ginsburg, for instance, used the time to recall all the things she had read, and she found that in the silence and solitude, her memory of books she had read came back to her almost completely, and that she used the time to write poetry in her head. And even when she was put in a dark cell, which was a punishment within the punishment, she knew she had to keep track of time. So every time they brought her bread and water, she would rend her shirt so that she could count the rips in her shirt and know how many days she had been in the cell. But for a lot of prisoners, for instance, there's evidence in the Eastern State Penitentiary that some of them may have been entered already having cognitive disabilities. Quite a few of them left with cognitive disabilities or went mad in their cells or went crazy. They were given work, and most of the prisoners loved the work for the structure it provided and depended on the work for a kind of sanity. So it was a feat of endurance for all of them. Some of them survived it, some did not. Charles Williams was let out of prison 2 years to the day after he was put in. He was given $4 and his street clothes, and I couldn't find any trace of him after that. I mean, he was a young black man with a very common name, so he was lost to the world. For monastics, nuns and priests who are in monasteries, it's often a challenge. A lot of postulants who enter do not end up leaving, but those who do stay and have chosen that life often find it very deep and rich. And Thomas Merton, he had a special place in the monastery because he was also a famous writer, so that it presented its own complexities, but he deeply valued that time he did have for silence and regarded it as a richness.
I think part of what you talk about in the book too is that for the monastic, that silence is a choice that's happening in community with the support of your community, and so that's part of Quaker worship is its silence in community. And then if people want to do some modern psychiatrists looking at the damaging effects of solitude. So
well, Charles Williams was an 18-year-old black farmer who was sentenced to 2 years in solitary and silent confinement for breaking into a house and stealing a gold key, a gold seal, and a gold watch. And he was brought to the jail. They had a whole ritual to bring him into the jail of bathing him, just as if you were entering a monastery, bathing him, cutting his hair, noting his scars, leading him to the cell, and then leaving him to that world. I think the rate was very high. The prisoners who were in Eastern State Penitentiary in 1829 were largely drawn, as you can imagine, from minorities and immigrants, what were known then as the dangerous classes. So even then, I think some of the aspects of prison were very similar to the aspects of prisons today in that sense. So it didn't really cure anybody of anything. Yeah. Someone behind you.
I recently went on a writers' retreat with main writers and publishers alliance up in North Lake Stream, and I had part of a poetry workshop with Stuart Preston there. And one of the exercises we did was to go for a walk in the woods as a group, and we were told nobody must say anything during this walk. So it was not a long period of time, but it was incredible. All of us, I think, in the group found it a very powerful and deep experience, sharing this silence in community. And that kind of takes me to Thomas Merton and his choice to be in a community that is largely silent, and also to the choice of being in a Quaker meeting, where my experience with silence in Quaker meeting is that the silence in community is a very powerful thing, and quite different from something like the silence of solitary confinement, where you're not with people and you haven't chosen it. And I wonder if it's
Yeah, and even Thomas Merton says at some point that the silence in the community was very distinct from the silence in the individual cell. That silence, in fact, isn't one, that's one of the things I think I learned over the years of writing the book, that silence isn't this monolithic thing, that it has the silence he experienced in his individual cell or later in his hermitage was very different, say, than the silence of working with the other monastics together or worshiping with the other monastics together. And, the silence within the liturgical services was in a way served to enhance everything that was spoken, everything that was vocalized. The beauty of the music would have been nothing without the silence surrounding it. So it's such a complex and layered thing that to say it is one thing, or to say it's the absence of noise, is really being very reductive. I did a lot of research on John Cage, and he never made it into the book except for an epigraph, which he said, "Silence is not acoustic. It's a change of mind, a turning around." And I found that to be really true. This woman has... That was a large part of it. It was to sort of lose yourself in the world and to be a vessel to allow the God to come in. They would have said, for instance, they weren't looking out into the world. The light, the beautiful the light that comes in through the monastery was God looking at them, not them looking out into the world. Does that make sense? Yeah. No. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's a wonderful idea, and certainly every city could use one on every block or something. What a lovely thing to think you could just duck into a room and sit in silence. I do that when I travel. I find these little churches, and I go in. I just want to be away, and I just want to be quiet. And I'll go next time. Yeah, yeah. They're like preserves, like the dark sky preserves that they have now, where there are no ambient light. We could have silent preserves everywhere. Yeah, yeah. And then
I was wondering if you looked into all Christian
the Eastern. You know, I thought about that, and then I thought the book would become, you know, to give due. You know, I didn't want to just, you know, talk about Eastern monasticism in a couple of paragraphs. I don't think that would have done it justice. So I had to make the decision to sort of, at the end, I do have Thomas Merton does go to Asia, and he meets with the Dalai Lama, and so I have part of that, his journey to Asia, but I couldn't take it's. I thought that's for someone else and for another book, or the next book. Yeah, yeah, it would be, and I do think there is a profound difference, and I realized that would have, you know, required another 100 pages of the book and sort of take it out of alignment in a way. Yeah, yeah. There's a woman over there who's. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of amazing that I mean the acknowledgement, all these things, the UN, the brain injury conferences, are an acknowledgement of the power of silence to just set a place aside for it. And I guess, yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, right. Yeah. No, that's true even of my autistic nephew who needs, you know, who wears earphones sometimes because he can't, the stimulation of the world around him is too much, right? Yeah. Right. I agree. I mean, let's start a movement of having little spaces for silence on every block. There's one more question.
Yeah, yeah. I actually brought with me a quote from Thomas Kelly, who's a Quaker writer about the experience of silence in Quaker meeting. And we call a meeting where the silence is particularly deep a gathered meeting. In the Quaker practice of group worship on the basis of silence come special times when the electric hush and solemnity and depth of power steals over the worshipers. A blanket of divine covering comes over the room, and a quickening presence pervades us, breaking down some part of the special privacy and isolation of our individual lives and bonding our spirit within a super-individual life and power. An objective, dynamic presence which enfolds us all, nourishes our souls, speaks glad, unutterable comfort within us, and quickens in us depths that before had been slumbering. The burning bush has been kindled in our midst, and we stand together on holy ground. And there is something different that happens when we are invite silence as a community and not just sort of on our own. Yep.
That's also one of the silences I didn't take. People always ask about that. No, you're not the first one. And it's another thing. That's another book for, you could write a whole book on that experience as well. Yeah. I mean, there are so many layers of experience with silence. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to add to comments about the prison meeting. One of the reasons that silence works there is that people come and can listen. So the silence is not just you against a space.
Right.
It is in some ways. But it's also what might come to me. I was like, what might I hear in my head or in my body or from someone that's there. So doing it in a group and with that intent is, I think, a different quality than doing it on your own, where you don't feel that.
Did you look at the connection between silence and loneliness? Loneliness seems to be really important aspect of the mind life. It's the lone, well,
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes through when I talk about the prison experience, because I think inextricable from Charles Williams and the other prisoners' experience was a profound loneliness of that, and how that it wore on them, and that the sense of isolation and not having another to close to them there. Yeah, so that weaves through, I think, the penitentiary segments of the book. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing to me is that the silence is extremely powerful, and I think at all times it holds both its positive and negatives together, and that because it's very mysterious in that it can feel very enriching one day and feel like torture the next in a really profound way. Yeah. Is that, yeah. Yeah.
You said you didn't go deeply into Eastern philosophy at the time. If you look at other cultures, now you know something that people may all assume, that every culture would recognize some of what you're talking about here. There's some culture where they say, I don't know what you're talking about. Whereas
That's
some similarities between some enforced silence when you remove them from society, some enforced silence when you're in society.
yeah.
Silence thought is something that's contemplative and restorative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I didn't go beyond the Western tradition. I stuck to the experience in Europe and the United States, because that also is the penitentiary tradition and the Western monastic tradition, so that it sort of circulates around there. But that's a really interesting angle to find out if that was the same, whether it would be the same in all cultures. I couldn't say yes or no confidently about that. So there is a website that lists 100 books on silence. I think it's a really good, I think it's called Encountering Silence, and it's really interesting.
I do, yeah, and I think there's some aspect of it that human experience as opposed to a culture
Right.
experience.
And different cultures, we ourselves, contemporary American culture, I think, is a culture of isolation more than others. I remember I had a friend who joined the Peace Corps and went to Ecuador, and he came to he was in the village, and they sent him off to his quarters, and they said, would you like somebody to be with you, to stay with you for company? I mean, they didn't want to leave him alone, because that seemed like such a abnormality to be living alone. Whereas we, in our culture now, most of us a majority, I think, of Americans live alone or something.
Really? Oh, that's
A
interesting. I
huge
didn't
number of
realize.
Americans live alone. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Ooh.
Well, I haven't had much time in the last few months but what I think I'm going to write about is, and this will be historical and have research, but it will be more personal, about how single women inhabit their homes, and how the history of it, how someone in the 19th century, a single woman in the 19th century was in a very different social world than I am in, and have much more limited freedoms, and how that experience has changed over time and over cultural changes. So anyway, yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see. I think it'll be a challenge to find. I think there's a lot of letters and diaries from middle class and upper middle class women. More of a challenge to find, say, working class women. Yeah, so it'll be interesting. Yeah. Yeah, or forced to live alone, and my house in Brunswick, there was a widow there in 1900, so it's kind of an interesting, I don't think many young women lived alone, but older women lived alone. Yeah, yeah. Anyway. Well, thank you all. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.